Thank you, Speaker. I move second reading of Bill 67, an act to amend the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act 1997 with respect to post-traumatic stress disorder.
Ms. DiNovo has moved second reading of Bill 67, an act to amend the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act 1997 with respect to post-traumatic stress disorder. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for a presentation. The member for Parkdale-High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the first thing I want to do is to acknowledge the presence of all of the folk here in the galleries, paramedics, firefighters, and of course our police officers. And I wanted to ask members to give them a round of applause for all that they do for us. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I want to note Bruce Kruger, David Whitley, and Jeffrey Balch, who this morning took part in a panel. And that panel talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. All of them have suffered from it, a paramedic, a firefighter, and a police officer, and outlined exactly why we need this bill. The reason we need this bill is that we need to accord dignity and support to those first responders who rush into danger when we rush out, who look after us. And we, Mr. Speaker, need to begin to look after them today. Let me tell you why, and I'm going to give you some stories. First of all, the story of Officer Bruce Kruger, who is now retired. Here's a little glimpse into the life of a police officer. Kruger insists, by the way, on having the right seat because, and Bruce is over here, he's fled airplanes, he's cried in restaurants, he's rearranged furniture at friends' homes, all for the perfect seat. That seat is backed against a wall, so no one can attack him from behind. Kruger says the sitting issue goes back to the murder of fellow OPP officer Tom Coffin in 1997. The killer came from behind and shot Coffin in the head at close range while Coffin was off duty in Penetanguishene. Kruger has been diagnosed with PTSD connected with his 30-year career. Here's some of the things he's experienced. Shooting and killing a prison escapee who was pointing a shotgun at his partner in 1977. Found slain OPP officer Rick Verdecchio frozen solid in a snowbank with 3 bullet holes between his eyes in 1978. Kruger, by the way, stayed with the body to protect the scene for several hours. Coming upon the bodies of a father and his 6-year-old son who had drowned in 1978 and having to row the bodies back to the shore of Healy Lake. Just a glimpse, Mr. Speaker, into the life of a police officer. Here's a glimpse into the life of a paramedic. This is from paramedic Ryan Cotton. He says, on December 2006, a woman had thrown her 2-year-old off the Morningside Bridge at the 401. Shortly after throwing her 2-year-old off the bridge, this woman, after fighting with bystanders, had successfully thrown herself over the Morningside Bridge onto the 401. He says, I was there, the very first paramedic to the 2-year-old. I was the second first responder to this child, as the first responder was a fireman who I found kneeling beside the child as he hung on to life, slowly dying. I never found out what happened to that fireman. What happened to Ryan was that he came down with post-traumatic stress disorder from that and other events. Here's a glimpse into the life of a firefighter. And this is written by his spouse. This is Tony Hulbeshen's story. She writes, my husband Tony had been a Hamilton firefighter for 30 years. It was a job he loved and one he was cut out to do. He had many close calls, having all his hair burned off, caught in flashovers, and electrocuted. But February 2002, something happened that would change our lives forever. His station was called to an apartment building at 181 Jackson Street in Hamilton. While Tony was on the main floor, the 2-inch concrete ceiling collapsed on him and he was buried. After some time, he was found by his brave co-workers. I got a call in the middle of the night telling me there had been an accident and I was to go to the hospital. It seemed like a nightmare. At the hospital, Tony had visible physical injuries. Little did we know about the other injuries. Tony came down with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is what our first responders do for us. This is what they do for us. And it's incumbent upon us, I feel, that we should protect them when they succumb to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to give you a little bit of history on this bill. In 2007, the government brought in a bill that originally our leader, Andrew Horvath, coined, and that was in relation to firefighters. And that was a presumed diagnosis of certain kinds of cancers. And this came out of the Placemet fire. Many who are here from the fire world will know about that. Because it's almost impossible to prove that you got those cancers from your work. And when you go to WSIB and you try to prove it, it's re-traumatizing. Well, you can imagine if that's true for cancer, it's even more true for post-traumatic stress disorder. We heard on the panel this morning about the long and grueling mechanism of having to prove you actually acquired post-traumatic stress disorder from your job. Virtually impossible to do, by the way, but in the process you have to provide names and dates, breach confidences, you have to bring into play all of the events that brought on your PTSD in the first place. This is not the way to treat our first responders. I want to read you something from the Clinical Psychology Review. They wrote in 2012, there are a limited number of occupations or professions that repeatedly put those so employed squarely in harm's way. Two prominent examples are combat soldiers and first responders. Indeed, the latter group often comprises members of the former. We recognize PTSD in our soldiers and all of our military, but we don't recognize it as part, sometimes, of the job they do in our first responders. Today, I hope to rectify that. I want to give a shout-out, too, to a special young woman, because she was the inspiration to this bill back many years ago. It first came to my attention by a constituent, Sharon Bertrand, who's here in the gallery as well, a young paramedic. And she outlined what she had to go through just to try to get, unsuccessfully really, some coverage from WSIB. And I want to say a few things, too, about maybe some of the concerns members might be having. One of the concerns that was brought to my attention was the possible cost to the municipalities about this. And I can tell you there's an answer to that question. First of all, Alberta has had this legislation in place as law since 2012. And my constituency assistant, and I want to give her a shout out too, she's watching in her office, Pichola Carpoche, she phoned all the cities in Alberta and she asked them, has this added to your expense? And they all said absolutely not. In some cases they say it streamlines it, because you can imagine the whole diagnostic process and assessment process that WSIB has to go through and that employers have to go through with them takes time. That would be eliminated, because again, we're presuming that somebody who gets PTSD and who's a first responder gets it from the job. Did the cases go up? We asked them, and they said absolutely not. The same number of cases, really, they said, as before. The difference was the dignity and support with which those who made claims were dealt with. These are important items to keep in mind. I know the government panel has put in place a panel to look at post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's really in the Ministry of Labour to look at prevention and awareness. And I think we've come to the point in Ontario where we understand that post-traumatic stress disorder, in fact, all mental illness, we understand it's truly an illness. These are not folk who are malingering. We've had ombudsman oversight and actually ombudsman input into this as well in Ontario. We've done a gamut of looking at the problem, and now it's time really to look at a solution. I had a superintendent in my own riding who said, police officer, who said that in the ceremonies to honour those who fall in the line of duty, he said all he could think about was one member of his force who had committed suicide, and he said, and he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and the superintendent said, and I wished we could honour him. So again, we want to honour those people. What does post-traumatic stress disorder look like? Well, you heard from the wife of a sufferer. What you didn't hear from her is the separation and divorce statistics associated with it, the alcoholism associated with it, the flashbacks, the anxiety disorder, sometimes obsessive-compulsive acts, terrible nightmares, sleeplessness, insomnia. It truly is a debilitating disease, and we can't make that point often enough. It truly is a debilitating disease. And again, I want to thank those who are brave enough. I have a file folder in my office about this thick of stories from people who have suffered from PTSD that are first responders. And I know that every one of those stories is not only a story of suffering for them and their families and their units and their friends, but also a tale of bravery that they were even able to put it to paper and send it to me, even able to say and speak about it on a panel this morning. That takes immense bravery. Why would we ask them to go over and over and over it again once the diagnosis is in place? It's cruel, it's unusual punishment, and it shouldn't happen. I want to talk about, too, I only have a few minutes left, who supports this. Ontario Provincial Police Association, Ontario Professional Firefighters Association, including the Toronto Professional Firefighters Association, Police Association of Ontario, which includes regional police associations, the Ontario Paramedic Association, which includes Toronto Paramedics Association, Tima Cantor Memorial Trust, OPSU, Unifor, QP, ATU, a host of people. In fact, almost 20,000 members will be covered by this bill if we pass it across Ontario, and I hope we will. There's a hashtag, and it's hashtag Heroes Are Human. And I believe that as we sit in this legislature this afternoon, as we look around, we look at the faces of those who've come in terrible weather, some of them driving long distances on the 400. Some of them are watching, by the way, on televisions and offices because they're still on call because of that terrible weather on our highways. But they're watching, and they're here, I'm sure, with somebody in mind. They're here, I'm sure, with somebody in mind. Some family, some person, someone who's put their life on the line, and this has been the result. Doesn't happen to everyone any more than cancers happen to every firefighter who runs into a fire. But to those it does happen to, we owe a huge debt. To those, we offer some support in this bill. And to those, I hope, if we all agree in this House, we will actually offer some help, finally. So I urge every member around this House to vote for this bill. A vote will come at the end of private members' public business. I look forward to what you have to say and to responding to what you have to say. And again, let's give a round of applause to those first responders who came out today in support of their colleagues and themselves and their families. Thank you.